Scorch Trials, Chapter 10, on this PDF, page 37. Thomas stood there for a full minute, staring at the man casually sitting at the desk, reading. It was as if he'd been reading that way and in that very spot every day for his whole life. Thin black hair combed across a pale, bald head, a long nose twisted slightly to the right, and shifty brown eyes darting back and forth as he read. The man somehow looked relaxed and nervous at the same time. And the white suit, pants, shirt, tie, coat, socks, shoes, all white. What in the world? Thomas looked over at the Gladers munching on fruit and a snack from a bag that looked like a mixture of nuts and seeds. They seemed oblivious to the man at the desk. "Who is that guy?" Thomas called out to no one in particular. One of the boys looked up, stopped chewing for a second, then he quickly finished off his mouthful and swallowed. "He won't tell us anything. Told us we had to wait till he's ready." The boy shrugged as if that wasn't a big deal and took another bite of a peeled orange. Thomas returned his attention to the stranger, still sitting there, still reading. He turned a page with a whispery scrape and continued scanning the words. Baffled, and with a stomach rumbling for more food, Thomas still couldn't help but walk toward the man to investigate. Of all the strange things to wake up to. "Careful," one of the Gladers called out, but it was too late. Just 10 feet in front of the desk, Thomas slammed into an invisible wall. His nose hit first, smashing against what he felt like a cold sheet of glass. The rest of his body followed suit, bumping against the unseen wall and making him stumble backward. He instinctively reached up to rub his nose as he squinted to see how he could have possibly missed the glass barrier. But no matter how hard he looked, he couldn't see anything, not the slightest glare or reflection, not a smudge anywhere. All he saw was air. All the while, the man hadn't bothered to move or give even the least hint he'd noticed anything. More slowly this time, Thomas approached the spot, holding his hands out. Soon he made contact with the wall of completely invisible what? It felt like glass, smooth, hard, and cool to the touch, but he saw absolutely nothing to indicate that something solid stood there. Frustrated, Thomas moved to the left, then the right, feeling along the unseen solid wall. It spanned the entire room. There was no way to approach the stranger at the desk. Thomas finally pounded on it, making a series of dull thumps, but nothing happened. Some of the Gladers behind him, Eris included, remarked how they'd already tried that. The strangely dressed man, just a dozen or so feet in front of him, let out an exaggerated sigh as he pulled his crossed feet from the desk and let them drop to the floor. He placed a finger in his book to mark his place and looked up at Thomas, making no effort to hide his annoyance. "How many times do I have to repeat this?" the man said, his nasally voice a perfect match for his pale skin, thin hair, and skinny body. And that suit. That stupid white suit. Oddly, his words weren't muffled at all by the barrier. "We still have 47 minutes before I've been authorized to implement phase 2 of the trials. Please show your patience and leave me alone. You've been given this time to eat and replenish yourselves, and I strongly suggest that you take advantage of it, young man. Now, if you don't mind." Without waiting for a response, he leaned back in his chair and returned his feet to the desktop. Then, opening his book to the spot he'd marked, he resumed reading. Thomas was truly speechless. He turned away from the man and the desk and leaned against the invisible wall, its hard surface pressing against his back. What had just happened? Surely he was still asleep, dreaming. For some reason, that thought alone seemed to amplify his hunger, and he longingly glanced over at the mound of food. Then he noticed Minot at the door to the dorm room, leaning against its frame with his arms folded. Thomas jabbed a thumb over his shoulder and raised his eyebrows. "You met our new friend?" Minot responded, a smirk flashing across his face. "Real piece of work, this guy. I gotta get me one of those shuck suits. Fancy stuff." Am I awake? Thomas asked. You're awake. Now eat. You look horrible, almost as bad as Rat Man over there reading his book. Thomas was surprised at how quickly he could set aside the oddness of the guy in the white suit appearing out of nowhere and the invisible wall. Again, that numbness that had become so familiar. After the initial shock, nothing was strange anymore. Anything could be normal. Pushing it all away, he dragged himself over to the food and started eating. Another apple, an orange, a bag of mixed nuts, and then a chewy bar of granola and raisins. His body begged for water, but he couldn't get himself to move quite yet. You need to slim it, Minot said from behind. We've got Shanks puking all over the place 'cause they ate too much. That's probably enough, dude. Thomas stood, relishing the feel of a full stomach, not missing at all that gnawing beast that had lived inside him for so long. He knew Minot was right. He had to slim it. He nodded at his friend before stepping around to go get a drink, the whole time wondering what could possibly be in store for them when the man in the white suit was ready to implement phase 2 of the trials, whatever that meant. Half-hour later, Thomas sat on the floor with the rest of the gladers, Minot to his right and Newt to his left, all of them facing the invisible wall and the weasel of a man sitting at the desk behind it. His feet were still propped up, his eyes still flickering down the pages of his book. Thomas felt the wonderful return of energy and strength slowly building inside him. The new kid, Eris, had given him a strange look in the bathroom, as if he wanted to speak telepathically with him but was afraid to do it. Thomas had ignored him and quickly walked to the sink and guzzled down as much water as he could with his now full stomach. By the time he finished and wiped his mouth on his sleeve, Eris had left. Now the boy sat over by the wall, staring at the floor. Thomas felt sorry for him. As bad as things were for the Gladers, Eris had it worse, especially if he'd been as close to the murdered girl he'd mentioned as Thomas was to Teresa. Minot was the first to break the silence. I think we've all gone psycho like those. What do they call themselves again? Cranks? The cranks at the windows? We're all sitting here waiting for a lecture from Ratman like this is totally normal, like we're at some kind of school. I can tell you this much. If he had anything good to say, he wouldn't need a freaking magic wall to protect him from us, now, would he? Just slim it and listen, Newt said. Maybe it's all going to be over. Yeah, right, Minot said. And Frypan's going to start having little babies. Winston'll get rid of his monster acne, and Thomas here'll actually smile for once. Thomas turned to Minot and exaggerated a fake smile. There, you happy? Dude, he responded, you're one ugly shank. If you say so. Shut your bloody holes, Newt whispered. I think it's time. Thomas looked over to see that the stranger, Ratman as Minot so kindly called him, has put his feet to the floor and placed the book on the desk. He scooted his chair back to get a better view of one of the drawers, then pulled it out and rummaged through things Thomas couldn't see. Finally, he pulled out a densely packed manila folder full of messy papers, many of them bent and sticking out at odd angles. Ah, here it is, Ratman said in his nasally voice. Then he placed the folder on the desk, opened it up, and looked at the boys in front of him. Thank you for gathering in an orderly manner so I can tell you what I've been instructed to tell you. Please listen carefully. Why do you need that wall? Minot shouted. Newt reached around Thomas and punched Minot in the arm. Shut it. Ratman continued as if he hadn't heard the outburst. You're all still here because of an uncanny will to survive despite the odds, among other reasons. About 60 people were sent to live in the glade. Well, your glade, anyway. Another 60 in Group B, but for now we'll forget about them. The man's eyes flicked to Eris, then went back to slowly scanning the crowd. Thomas didn't know if anyone else had noticed, but he had no doubt that there'd been a hint of familiarity in that quick look. What did it mean? Out of all those people, only a fraction survived to be here today. I'm assuming you've figured this out by now, but many of the things that happened to you are solely for the purpose of judging and analyzing your responses. And yet it's not really an experiment as much as it is constructing a blueprint, stimulating the kill zone and collecting the resultant patterns, putting them all together to achieve the greatest breakthrough in the history of science and medicine. These situations inflicted upon you are called the variables, and each one has been meticulously thought out. I'll explain more soon. And though I can't tell you everything at this time, it's vital that you know this much. These trials you're going through are for a very important cause. Continue to respond well to the variables, continue to survive, and you'll be rewarded with the knowledge that you played a part in saving the human race. And yourselves, of course. Ratman paused, apparently for effort. Thomas looked over at Minot and raised his eyebrows. "This dude's shucked in the head," Minot whispered. "How would escaping a freaking maze save the human race?" "I represent a group called Wicked," Ratman continued. "I know it sounds menacing, but it stands for World in Catastrophe Kill Zone Experiment Department. Nothing menacing about it, despite what you may think. We exist for one purpose and one purpose only, to save the world from catastrophe. You here in this room are a vital part of what we plan to do. We have resources never known to any group of any kind in the history of civilization. Nearly unlimited money, unlimited human capital and technology, advanced beyond even the most clever man's wants and wishes. As you make your way through the trials, you have seen and will continue to see evidence of this technology and the resources behind it. If I can tell you anything today, it is that you should never, ever believe your eyes, or your mind for that matter. This is why we did the demonstration with the hanging bodies and the bricked up windows. All I will say is that sometimes what you see is not real, and sometimes what you do not see is real. We can manipulate your brains and nerve receptacles when necessary. I know it all sounds confusing and a little scary, perhaps." Thomas thought the man couldn't have possibly made a greater understatement, and the word kill zone kept bouncing around in his head. His scarcely revived memories couldn't quite grasp what it meant. But he'd first seen it on the metal plaque back in the maze, the one that had spelled out the words that made up Wicked's acronym. The man slowly passed his eyes over every glader in the room. His upper lip shone with sweat. "The maze was part of the trials. No one variable was thrown at you that you didn't serve a purpose for our collection of kill zone patterns. Your escape was part of the trials, your battle against the grievers, the murder of the boy Chuck, the supposed rescue and subsequent trip in the bus, all of it part of the trials." Anger swelled in Thomas's chest at the mention of Chuck. He'd half risen to his feet before he knew what had come over him. Newt pulled him back down to the floor. As if spurred by this, Ratman quickly stood up in front of his chair, sending it back against the wall behind him. Then he placed his hands on the desk and leaned towards the gladers. "All of it has been part of the trials, you understand. Phase 1, to be exact. And we are still dangerously short of what we need. So we've had to up the ante, and now it's time for Phase 2. It's time for things to get difficult."